Hey everybody, welcome to Nexus Technologies. On today's video, we're going to be learning how to change the FEP film in your resin vat on your 3D printer. Now, changing the FEP film at the bottom of your resin vat is something that you're going to have to do over the life of your 3D printer regardless. But in my case, I'm doing it because I got a little bit of damage on mine. There was a little bit of forward material on my build plate that I didn't notice until I actually went to print. And so it started to push through the FEP, and you can actually see the bubble that it caused here. When I put my finger up to it, you can feel the raised edge on the other side, and I'm really kind of worried that it might puncture and start spilling resin inside the printer itself, so we're just going to go ahead and replace the FEP to prevent that. As always, when working with resin, you're going to want to make sure that you take safety into account by wearing proper protective equipment. In this case, I'm wearing gloves to prevent any resin from getting on my hands. Now, the first thing that you want to do is wipe down the inside of the vat to make sure that there's no excess resin that might spill or get everywhere while you're actually working on the FEP. You don't have to worry about scratching the FEP since you're going to be changing it anyway, so in this instance I just use some rough paper towel. After wiping the vat down for any excess resin, you're going to go ahead and flip it on its back so you can better access the screws that hold it together. To undo the screws, you're going to take a standard 2.5mm hex wrench and undo the screws located on each side of the resin vat. Thankfully, Elglue included a 2.5mm hex wrench with their starter toolkit, so I'm using that here. You may notice this isn't our usual work area. Now, since I was working with a new piece of FEP, I didn't want to get it dirty or get any smudges on it before I even put it in the printer, so I just took a scrap of plastic covering that we had laying around and laid it out over our work table, just to prevent any residue or anything from getting on the underside of that FEP. While we're taking those screws off, I just want to take a moment to give a shout out to some of the people that left comments on my last video saying that I helped them pick a printer. Adam Edwards, Bright Novastar, Dylan Max, Mobina, and TechTac2930. You guys are awesome. Thanks for the comments. Keep it up. I hope to see you around more often. With the screws that secure the frame to the main vat removed, you should find that the frame falls out pretty easily once you turn the vat upside down. With the frame removed from the vat, you're free to go ahead and remove the screws that are securing the FEP to the frame. Removing the screws from the frame is the same process as removing the screws from the vat. This time you're going to take a 2mm hex wrench and remove all the screws that are holding the two pieces of the frame together. Once you've removed all the screws from the FEP frame, you should be able to pull it apart fairly easily, which will allow you to access the FEP sheet itself. Now that you've removed all the screws that secure the FEP sheet to the frame itself, it should pop out with zero resistance. Before we go any further, I went ahead and wiped down the frame with a cloth. This was just to catch any resin or residue that I might have missed earlier that might transfer to the new FEP we're going to be installing. I find it's a lot easier to keep a new sheet of FEP clean than it is to clean the sheet of FEP when it gets dirty later on. Alright, you've officially made it halfway to changing your FEP. I'm going to go ahead and change out my gloves here because there might be some resin from wiping down the vat earlier. There is residue that's on your fingers from the oils that you carry on your body, so I thought it was a good idea to put on a new pair of gloves just to prevent any of the oils from my hands transferring to the FEP film itself. One of the main concerns that I hear brought up when changing out the FEP is maintaining the correct tension on the sheet itself. I found a really easy way to do this is to just take a standard bottle cap and wrap it a couple times in some tissue paper to prevent any of the sharp edges of the cap from rubbing up against the film. After you've wrapped it up a couple of times to make sure that there's no sharp or jagged edges, you're going to go ahead and place it in the center of the frame underneath the new sheet of FEP film. With the new piece of film placed correctly over the frame, you're going to go ahead and take the other half of the frame and place it back over the film, making sure that the beveled edges are facing you. Now, with the FEP seated correctly between the two halves of the frame, you're going to take the smaller screws that you removed from the frame earlier and begin rescrewing them into the frame. You may need to apply significant force to actually allow the screw to penetrate the FEP and to be screwed into the frame. Once you get the 4 screws in the corners, you don't really have to worry about keeping tension on the FEP anymore, as those screws are going to keep the FEP in a position that keeps the tension from earlier. So I find it's really helpful at this point if you go ahead and begin poking holes through the other screw holes that you're going to have to put the screws in. This is going to make it significantly easier when you actually go to screw in the rest of those screws. And a really easy way that you can do this is just take that small Allen key that you're using for these screws and just give it a quick push and twist through the screw hole, just penetrate the FEP. You really just want to make sure that there's a little bit of a hole so that when you go with the screw later, you can actually get it in there fairly easily. The last part of actually changing the FEP is just putting the last remaining screws in. and you're technically done changing the FEP at this point. You've changed out the film. The last thing that we're going to do is reattach the frame to the vat, and then the vat should be ready to go back into the printer here. It was at this point that I opted to take my gloves off just so I could get a little better grip on the screws, and I felt like I didn't really need them at this point, as I could be careful enough to not get anything on the FEP. Now, just like with the frame, you're going to want to make sure that the beveled edges are facing you. If they're not, when you try to put these screws in, you're going to spend more than a few minutes wondering why no matter how hard you push on them or how hard you try to get them in there, they just won't screw into the vat. And that's kind of what happened to me here, so it's definitely a lesson learned to pay attention to which direction the bevels on this are facing. You may want to make sure that there's no gaps or anything in between the vat and the frame itself, as that could lead to resin leaking out of the vat, and that would lead to a catastrophic failure of your printer, and nobody wants that. Now, these screws were significantly easier to get into place than the ones that were going into the frame. I'm assuming that's because of the lack of tension present on these screws, but you do want to make sure that you are getting them down as tight as possible, because they are the last line of defense between any resin leaking out of your vat and into your printer. The final step in changing your FEP is using a utility knife to cut away any scrap material that may be overhanging from the frame. Once you've pulled away any scrap FEP, you successfully completed the changing of your FEP film and are ready to print again. And that's all there is to it. The new FEP is looking pretty beautiful in there. There's no damage and it's so clear that you can barely tell that it's there. Now, this video helped you change the FEP in your own printer, or you guys just want to see more printer maintenance videos, go ahead and leave a comment down below. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and don't forget to hit that bell icon so that you get a notification every time a new video comes out. Thanks for keeping up with the channel, I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you next time.